When you're reading, it's always a good idea to try and imagine or visualize the things that you're actually reading, visualize the words rather that you're reading, because the author is trying to create an image in your mind that helps you to understand what's actually going on. So for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to use images to represent words, and then we'll go back to words and see how we visualize those. So have a look at this image. What can you see with this? Can you see any animals, any patterns, any people? Is anything recognizable in it at all? What about in this image? Sure, you can tell it's much easier to understand. You can see obviously that it's a shipyard, probably a historical one. Maybe it's made up in the mind of the artist, but in any case it's much easier to understand than the previous one. Now I've got them side by side, and the reason why the one on the left is so difficult to understand is because that is an abstract painting, and the one on the right is more like a concrete painting, or it's got concrete imagery rather. Technically it's figurative painting, but for the sake of this lesson we'll refer to it as concrete. So the theory or the idea is the same in literature. Abstract nouns are used to make you think a lot more. They're an intellectual element, so they usually make you connect to the characters in the story. They try and make you, the authors will use them to try and make you think about what's going on in their minds and to think about what they're feeling at the time. Concrete imagery is much more easy to understand, so authors will tend to use them to set the scene, but they also tend to symbolize certain ideas as well. So concrete nouns can be used to symbolize abstract ideas. So now we're going to look at these stories. One of them is abstract and one of them is concrete. Okay, so the one on the left is our abstract story. So I'll just read that to you. There was once a person who lived multiple lives. Some knew them as one name, others as another, and some knew them for no name at all, just a ghost they glimpsed in passing. So you can see how abstract that is. There's hardly anything at all which is concrete. Maybe person is slightly concrete. Ghost, I suppose, is meant to be concrete, but really it's abstract because, well, unless you've seen a ghost, then it's very difficult to understand what it actually looks like. And otherwise we've got abstract nouns like lives, we've got name as well, and yeah, so that's really it. So the author's really forcing us to work quite hard there, and we've got to really make the scene ourselves. So we've got to try and imagine what's actually going on there. Now let's look at the one on the right, the Hunger Games. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover on the mattress. So here we've got bed, it's concrete, fingers, that's concrete as well. Canvas, cover, and mattress. So we've got quite a few concrete nouns there to help us understand what's going on. Maybe warmth is an abstract noun, but you can see there's a much higher concentration of concrete nouns here than there is in the other one, and they're both of the same length. They're both taken from the beginnings of stories, so you can see how much easier it is for us to understand the Hunger Games. So this lesson is part of the GCSE English language revision. We're going to be looking at concrete nouns specifically in this lesson. So why should you know about concrete nouns? Think about paper 1 and paper 2. Do you know which questions you'll actually score marks on by understanding what they are and how they affect the writing? So paper 1, question 2 and question 4, and paper 2, question 3 and question 4. Those are all the questions that you will score marks on for understanding concrete nouns. Okay, you don't have to talk about concrete nouns, but they are one of the techniques, or one of the techniques that the author will use, and will help you to score marks on this. So paper 1, question 2, that's going to be language. Paper 2, question 3, that's language as well. Paper 1, question 4 is an evaluative question. So you evaluate a statement, and for this one you can analyze any of the author's methods. So you can analyze the form, you can analyze the structure, you can analyze the language, and so this will come in handy there. And that's the same for paper 2, question 4. The only difference is that in paper 2, question 4, you have to compare two writers' methods. So you can talk about how they use concrete nouns in both of them. So for this lesson, we're going to identify, define, and analyze concrete nouns. The key terms are dystopia, which is an imagined state or society in which there is great injustice and suffering. Semantic field, which is a set of words related in meaning. And allusion, a brief and indirect reference to a person, place, thing, book, etc. of historical importance. So literature is about humanity, nothing more, nothing less. This is extremely important for you to remember, because every single story that you're going to read is going to be about humanity. So it's very important that you understand that you need to recognize the conflicts that are going on in the story and what are the ideas and the topics that the author is trying to discuss in the story. If you can do those things, then you will be able to write a much more perceptive analysis. So what are concrete nouns? Well, they name things that we can recognize through our senses, and they are everyday objects. So they can be things like family, things like animals, food, the weather, such as the sun. So you can see that they're the things that we recognize through our sense of touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. The author may be trying to create images like these ones, so maybe they'll try and describe a beach setting or a sunset or urban life or a journey, so a road, some wildlife, some food. And you can see that I've said we use concrete nouns to fashion a three-dimensional world within the story. So these are some more images. And what are the effects of concrete nouns? Now this is extremely important for you, because the only time that you actually gain any marks is when you talk about the effects. So concrete nouns help to create an illusion of a world within the story. They bring familiarity to the text by naming everyday objects. They give the reader material with which to work their imaginations. They allow us to fashion a tangible, realistic, three-dimensional world within our minds, and they can act as symbols for ideas as well. This is not an exhaustive list, and what you have to remember is that in every story, the author is going to be using whatever techniques they're using for their own purpose. So these are just general effects that you will probably be able to use, but you also have to think about the context of your story. So make sure that if you are using these effects to talk about the nouns in the story that you are analyzing, then you need to make sure that it's relevant to the context of the story. So think about this for a second. When do authors tend to use concrete nouns the most? As we said, at the beginning of the story, to help the reader construct a three-dimensional world within their minds. So let's look at an example task. Find the concrete nouns in the text on the next slide. So this extract is taken from the opening of the 1963 novel Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Guy Montag, a fireman, lives in a futuristic city where he and his co-workers start fires rather than put them out. Books are banned and burned upon discovery, and Montag has no qualms about his responsibility. So, it was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass nozzle in his fists, with his great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. So you might want to pause this here, have a look and try and find the concrete nouns. I'm going to move on. So I've highlighted them there for you. So you've got nozzle, fist, python, kerosene, world, blood, head, hands, and conductor. So now remember that when you're reading, you need to try and visualize them. So try and create the image in your head, because that's what the author wants you to do. So these images are there to represent the concrete nouns that we've spotted in the text. So we've got fist down here, hands, blood, python, fire, and we've got the nozzles here as well. Now fire is not mentioned explicitly, but we see they're blazing and burning, so we understand that there is fire involved. Obviously it's implicit, but it's going to help us with our analysis in this case. Okay, so think symbolically. Now you've identified the concrete nouns, think about what they represent. So, for example, fists could represent power, corruption, or violence. The hand could represent human agency, the ability to do good or evil. Blood can represent humanity and death. The snake and fire are both classic religious symbols. The snake is a classic symbol of evil and deception, and fire is a classic symbol of destruction and sin, or rather the consequences of sin. And here we've got the kerosene or the nozzles, and we can say that maybe the idea is that Guy Montag is using them, is abusing what we normally use as energy for fuel. So instead of using it for the purpose of helping us to get from place to place or helping us to complete certain jobs, he's using it to burn books. Okay, so this is a sample answer. I've called this version 1, so I've made two sample answers. So you can see in this one, I've put the technical terminology in turquoise highlights. So tone, sadistic, concrete nouns, negative connotations, semantic field, concrete imagery, allusion, and symbolism. The words signifying the effects are in grey, so create, connotes, suggest, seems to suggest, and suggesting. The yellow highlights are the topics. These are the topics or the ideas that the symbols represent, the concrete symbols. So dystopian, power, violence, deception, evil, totalitarianism. You can see that some ideas have evolved slightly, but they're still more or less on the same sort of idea. So the other important thing to remember when you're analyzing is how you quote. I see a lot of students will write a quote and then write the explanation afterwards. It's a very, very clumsy way and mechanical way of analyzing. So what you really want to do is pick 1 or 2 words if you can. If you need to pick more, that's fine, 3, 4, 5. Even if you need to write quite a long sentence, depending on what you're trying to say, if you're forced into that position where you've got to put in a long quote, that's fine. You just introduce that with a colon. But if you can, what you really want to do is just pick a few words and just slot that into your sentence so that your sentence just flows like a normal sentence. And the examiners will be looking for that for writers who can embed, or students who can embed their quotes, because that's one of the signs of a top-level student. So the general tone of the language is very sadistic, and Bradbury uses a high concentration of concrete nouns, all featuring negative connotations, to create a dystopian semantic field. For example, the concrete imagery of fists connotes both victory and violence. On one hand, it may suggest that Guy Montag revels in his power to be able to burn things as a type of victory over the ordinary people. But we are also left with the impression that he is perhaps capable of physical violence. The image of the python may be seen as a classic allusion to religious symbolism of evil and deception, which perhaps gives us an insight into the author's perspective of the dystopic scene he is describing. It seems to suggest that Bradbury sees totalitarianism as both evil and deceptive, but perhaps he is also suggesting that those who engage in such an ideology do it with a sense of pleasure, an idea which makes it all the more frightening for the reader. So we're going to move on to version 2 now. You can see there's going to be some slight differences. So for example, I've used the discourse marker here, so you can use those as well. And you'll see at the end that I've included the author's purpose as well. So the general tone of the language is very sadistic, and Bradbury uses a high concentration of concrete nouns which feature negative connotations to provide rapid access to our imaginations. The dystopian semantic field of fists, python, hands, kerosene, and blood help us to fashion a three-dimensional world within our minds, of a world ruled by abuse of power, deceit, and corruption of humanity. Additionally, each concrete noun seems symbolic. For example, fists may symbolize both victory and violence. On one hand, it may suggest that Guy Montag revels in his power to burn things as a type of victory over the ordinary people, but we are also left with the impression that he is perhaps capable of physical violence as a way of stamping his authority. The negative portrayal of the society may be a warning by the author of the consequences of becoming apathetic towards deceit, abuse of power, and corruption. So you can see as well, when we looked at the effects of concrete nouns, so for example, provide rapid access to our imaginations. I've included those in here, but I've made sure that this explanation is relevant to the story. So I don't want to make any irresponsible interpretations by just putting stuff in that doesn't make sense in the context of the story. And I've signified the explanation with this semicolon here. So that's what you can do. The dystopian semantic field of fists, python hands, and kerosene and blood help us fashion a three-dimensional world within our minds. So this as well, fashion a three-dimensional world within our minds. This was also part of the effects that we spoke about earlier on. And you can see at the end there, I've got the author's purpose. The negative portrayal of the society may be a warning by the author of the consequences of becoming apathetic towards deceit, abuse of power, and corruption. So, in summary, concrete nouns are needed to build the fictional world. Concrete nouns are often symbolic, and remember the connotations and the effect on the reader as well. Hope you found that useful, and if you did, please subscribe for more.